Welcome to another episode of the Co-Management Show. In this podcast, I'm by myself, and I wanted to take this opportunity to share many of my insights from a great new book that you should read if you're interested in co-management with Indigenous peoples. If you're going to be successful with co-management today, I feel, and if you're going to achieve reconciliation success stories, there needs to be awareness about the history of injustices related to fish and wildlife co-management and understanding of how these histories impact our modern day efforts to do research projects where knowledge is co-produced or where decisions are made through consensus and everybody is happy to be implementing them together. I'll share a short reading from the book I'm referring to titled Treaty Justice, the Northwest Tribes, the Boldt Decision, and the Recognition of Fishing Rights by Charles Wilkinson. It is no small thing when societies immersed in intense, long-standing public disputes over emotional and divisive issues find a way to come together and make the rule of law a working, real-world reality. It is even more rewarding when it moves beyond compromise to genuinely improved professional and personal relationships. The state and the tribes continue to have many disagreements and always will. Their ultimate goals and beliefs differ. Nonetheless, the people of Washington and Oregon as well should be everlastingly proud of what their judges, political leaders, tribal leaders, and citizenry accomplished over the 50 years since the Boldt Decision. That's a short reading from the book, and the story that unfolds offers a lot of hope for the future and shows that justice is possible. But before you get to this point in the book, be prepared to read about a lot of injustice as well. You have to do that really to appreciate the challenges before people in this field of work, co-management. I discovered the book because I wanted to learn more about the Boldt Decision specifically, and I was searching for a book to read. I wasn't expecting to find one that was hot off the press, and I certainly wasn't expecting one so well written and engaging. I really couldn't put the book down until I had gotten it all read. I immediately wanted to talk to the author, Charles Wilkinson, but sadly he had passed away in 2023. And from what I learned about Charles Wilkinson from the book, he was certainly deeply committed to Indigenous self-determination and clearly had quality and trusting relationships with the Northwest tribes who entrusted him to capture such an important piece of their history. At first, I was a little unsure what a book about the law would be like to read, but it turned out that the book was so much more than just a judge's decision. I was immediately intrigued by the table of contents and the use of quotes. Right away, I assumed the author had an appreciation for the social sciences and capturing the voices of the Northwest tribes that are at the center of this story. And here's an example of that from chapter 1, titled Fury and the Puyallup River. The police, in quotes, were all up on the bridge with rifles, and we could see their rifles kicking, and you could feel the bullets going by. There was nowhere you could go. So after reading the title of that chapter, how could you not want to get started immediately reading it and digging in? And that's what I did, and I hope you will as well. To understand the context of the Boldt Decision, you really have to understand the historical context of colonialism and U.S. expansion into what is now Washington State in the U.S. The book really brings you back in time to the 1800s and helps you visualize life at that time for the salmon people. The chapter 2 title has the quote, "Those Fraser River salmon are like the blood in your veins. It's part of you." There were many other great quotes that help you appreciate how important salmon are in this part of the world. For example, some other quotes I'll quickly read from people in the region that were captured. In quotes, the definition of the Pacific Northwest is anywhere that Pacific salmon run. Another quote, salmon are the soul of the Pacific Northwest. Another quote, since the ice ages, the Pacific Northwest's muscular fish has embodied the health and vitality of this region. And salmon are an icon. Another in quotes, the ocean made us rich. These quotes really capture the essence of a place, the people, and obviously the importance of Pacific salmon. I really enjoyed reading about the rich diversity of tribes in Washington state, and it was easy to visualize the culturally distinct, stable, independent, and economically productive trade that didn't affect the sustainability of the salmon runs at that time. The chapters that follow will possibly anger you depending on the political views of these topics that you hold. But in a nutshell, you'll get a sense of what terrorism was like at that time for the tribes. The chapter 3 title quote reads, for example, "In this bottle I hold the smallpox safely corked up, but I have but to draw the cork and let loose the pestilence to sweep man, woman, and child from the face of the earth." So you can imagine how terrifying that would have been. And the arrival of Europeans changed everything in this region, just like it did in so many other parts of the world. The book goes on in detail to share how treaties were negotiated at the time. And I felt like reading the book, I could really visualize what it must have been like to be at those meetings. The treaties were negotiated at a frantic pace by a pivotal character named Isaac Stevens. I won't go into all of his backstory, but his goal was to open up Indian lands for settlement. And his ambition, I would say, had a lot of influence on what was included in the treaties, but also what was not included because of the fast paced, the tactics, and the obvious miscommunication, misunderstandings, and power imbalances that were at play during the treaty negotiations. As you might imagine, tribal leaders who fought hard and resisted treaties put themselves at great danger, and many died at that time to protect their culture. I'd like to share this one quote from one of those tribal leaders called Leshy, who said during an appeal, "Whatever the future holds, do not forget who you are. Teach your children, teach your children's children, and then teach their children also. Teach them the pride of a great people." And this quote really illustrates how indigenous knowledge systems are intended to live on through the generations. But very sadly, this tribal leader, Leshy, he would be hung and all of his knowledge would be gone. But I have no doubt he passed on what he could during his life. And the person that hung him wrote, "I felt then I was hanging an innocent man, and I believe it yet." So after the treaties were signed, under all of those really dire circumstances, there was aggressive expansion that ensued, and little attention was ever paid to these treaties again until the Boldt Decision in the 70s. The world would later learn that the treaties were actually very important and they contain crucial rights, and the tribes had the status of governments. They were recognized as such. by the US, and individual states couldn't just go and override that fact, despite their many attempts to do so. So the salmon people of the Northwest went through an extended period of suppression, and it's a testament of true resilience, really, because despite decades and generations of suppression and many attempts, in quotes I'll read, killing the Indian to save the man, the tribes in modern day Washington state did rise up again and get organized during the same time period as the civil rights movement in the US. But during the suppression period, the region saw the invention of canneries and the mammoth unregulated harvesting operations began. And that was really a point in time that you can certainly be assured that the decline of the Northwest salmon run began and continues today, unfortunately. But here's another short reading from the book that puts this into context, where an analysis was provided by author Arthur McAvoy in his book, The Fisherman's Problem. And he made the observation: here was the fisherman's problem in laboratory form. Access to salmon was free to anyone who could put a gill net into the water or who had capital to build a cannery. The industry's gauntlet simply permitted too few fish to escape upstream to spawn new ones for future runs. Any fisher or canner who might have left a salmon in the water so as to conserve their resource would simply have given that fish to competitors. That description really gives you a sense of how the tragedy of the commons could unfold. And with all of this context of colonialism, treaties that were negotiated in undesirable situations, generations of suppression, and extensive overfishing by the new settlers, we get to a period when the historical treaties would be interpreted by the courts in a series of major court decisions. And as the title of the book gives away, Judge Boldt would become one of the most famous of the court judges, and his historic decision is not the only relevant case that relates to this story. So I really think you'll find that part of the book very interesting. The book brought me personally on a roller coaster of emotions, as there were many important cases prior to the Bolt's decision in Oregon. And implementing the Boldt decision required the strongest of will. I can't imagine what the judge was going through at that time to uphold his decision. And ultimately, he was put in a position where he had to take over the fishery as a single judge at one point to try to maintain the rule of law. And this part of the U.S. lost all sense of the rule of law for a period of time. And it's fair to say that Judge Bolt's decision caused a lot of chaos in the area. But from my perspective, it was necessary chaos to clearly correct an injustice. I don't want to give away the plot here for those who are not familiar with the case, but it is a true act of reconciliation. Judge Boldt would hand down a decision that essentially triggered a mammoth reallocation of fish resources back to the Northwest tribes. It's very substantive and meaningful. And to me, that's what reconciliation is. There needs to be a level of accommodation in a lot of these disputes that we encounter today if we're going to correct historical injustice. And obviously, when this decision was made, it triggered civil unrest, violence, racism, terrorism, gross overexploitation of the salmon resources by non-Indigenous fishers. And when it came to implementing the law at the time, it just was not happening. The region had gone into a state of lawlessness in terms of fisheries enforcement. And to get a true appreciation of this turbulence, I'm recommending that you read the book because there isn't anything I can say here that would truly capture the situation created by a city of non-Indigenous fishers leading a rebellion against the U.S. federal government. You can imagine what that may have looked like and how difficult it was for all parties. And the Supreme Court in the US would eventually say, and I'll read in quotes, except for some desegregation cases, the district court has faced the most concerted public and private efforts to frustrate a decree of a federal court ever witnessed in this country. So there's a real message there, and hard to believe that the rule of law would just be lost over a judge's decision, and really gives you a sense of how turbulent the time was and what implementation would take and how much will would be needed. Eventually, co-management does enter the equation, but it certainly was never a harmonious or negotiated route to co-management. There were many more court cases that eventually got it to the point that it is today. And I make that point because I don't want new learners about co-management to think that it is happening today out of altruism or some moral high ground. To get to a stage of co-management, Indigenous peoples have endured radical attempts to sever their relationships with a variety of species and ways of accessing the land. And in this book, we're obviously talking about salmon, but I can tell you that this is basically what has played itself out in many of the co-management situations throughout Canada, for example. Just co-management arrangements didn't simply appear out of goodwill. The tribal leaders in Washington state, they organized themselves in a major way in the 1950s onward after World War II and during the civil rights movement. There were many new organizations that were formed, new leaders emerged, and the tribes really started to use their own forms of civil disobedience to fight back against Washington state and the non-Indigenous fishers that simply weren't obeying the law anymore. And this period then produced another wave of Indigenous heroes that successfully fought to have their treaties honored. The timing of all this advocacy lines up with movements at the time in Canada as well. It was clearly a revival period, I guess you could say, for Indigenous advocacy. And the Boldt Decision recently had a 50-year anniversary, and I like how this book ends because 50 years is a great time to reflect on the legacy and the impact of a revolutionary court case. And when you read this book, you do get a sense of its impacts that are still unfolding today. And there are many critics of the Boldt decision by non Indigenous commercial fishers in particular and sports fishers, but very few critics who are Indigenous or allies of Indigenous peoples. And this might seem a little bit nitpicky, but there was only one part of the Boldt decision that I did struggle with a little bit. I will premise this by saying it may also very well have been a very critical part of the treaty. But the part of the court decision I'm referring to was a prescriptive set of criteria that the judge did put in place at that time to determine when the tribes were actually ready to manage fisheries on their own. And as you might imagine, the criteria were rooted in Western science and Western approaches to managing fisheries. So I know there are multiple ways to debate that part of the Boldt decision, but for me personally, and the way I think about these situations, I certainly feel that the tribes would have always had their appropriate ways of managing these fisheries, and it wouldn't have needed the validation of a judge or a scientist to determine if they were ready or not. And I see that as being paternalistic, but to Judge Bolt's credit, he clearly thought many years ahead into the future and must have fought as hard as anyone to make sure that the rule of law was upheld and co-management was eventually achieved. So I'm certainly not in a position to be the judge, and the successes that followed may never have materialized, for example, if science wasn't part of the prescription, if you will, that was laid out. But those are just some counter thoughts that come to my mind when I was reading the book and kind of had my own reaction, I guess I could say, to that part. In the context of this co-management commons show, which is primarily focused on Canada, I'm highlighting this case because it did have an impact in Canada. In particular, in one of Canada's more famous court cases referred to as the Sparrow Decision. It was also a case that would later affirm Aboriginal fishing rights, and it provided a legal test to determine if government could justify infringing on Aboriginal rights. So there were similarities between this case and the Boldt decision, which also talked about topics like that. And was state or U.S. intervention necessary? And certainly the state laws were not intended to be forms of harassment, which was basically what was happening for a large period of time. There's also an interesting Canadian connection that's important to this history. Dr. Barbara Lane, she was an anthropologist from British Columbia who rejected the traditional academic career and dedicated her research to the Northwest tribes and the Washington state area. And her research, and it also seemed like the manner in which she delivered her research during the Boldt case hearings were considered extremely influential. And I thought that connection was interesting. She is certainly one of the heroes in this book. And it was interesting to see how the credibility of research was really influential in these hearings. And the judge was very clear about wanting to receive credible research in a thoughtful way. And he certainly didn't take kindly to the lack of effort that was put into the case by some fellow anthropologists that were arguing on behalf of the state of Washington at that time. There were so many heroes that made the events in this book possible. And in the end, the book is about hope. The efficacy of co-management becomes very clear and hopeful despite having to arrive at that point through the darkest of circumstances. And the final chapter really captures an amazing legacy of follow-up impacts from this court decision. It's fair to say that the environment, the fish, the tribes, and everyone else in Washington and around the world really are better off because of the major successes that ensued from this major decision. And I give big credit to all involved with making sure that the judge's decision was upheld and implemented. It certainly was a very difficult task. It goes without saying, in my mind, that we should be honoring the spirit and intent of treaties like the ones that were signed in this case. But if we look at the positive outcomes that are happening now as a result of co-management in the Northwest US, the non-Indigenous fishers should not lament this Boldt decision either. It really should be celebrated by all. And I say that because the new threats of today, like climate change, are going to require all hands on deck to find solutions for sustainable salmon populations. So I hope that co-management can be embraced in more situations in an authentic and voluntary way, because it is a better way of doing business. For people that are serious to learn about co-management, I have to say this book is a must read. It will help you visualize the historical context that has led to many of the co-management situations in Canada, whether it was the famous injunction that led to the first land claim agreements in Canada and the co-management regimes of northern Quebec with the Inuit and the Cree, or the Burger Inquiry in the Northwest Territories that put a halt to pipeline development until land claims were negotiated out west. It's a really foundational point that we all need to grapple with when we're trying to do our work now in the modern context. I think this book also makes another clear point that people should understand about co-management, and that is negotiating a treaty is only half the battle. In the context of time, it might not even amount to half the battle in the years to come. Implementation continues to be much harder than it needs to be if all parties are truly at the table in a good way. And upholding treaties and implementing true co-management shouldn't continue to be a battle in my mind. The challenges are hard enough on their own without the constant friction and power struggles. So, needless to say, I'm recommending this book. I'm very grateful that it was written. And for anyone engaged in co-management, I feel like this is foundational reading. It really sets up a holistic situation that will make you appreciate so many other situations around the world. And there really is transferability in the learnings from this book. And for anyone resisting co-management, I'd ask you to also read this book and be open-minded about the things that are possible. And I think you'll find that if hope could be found in a situation like this, a lot of our thinking and the tools that we have available have certainly advanced since the period of this court decision. So there's no reason why we can't be making more progress today and really enhancing the reconciliation impact that could come from co-management regimes in Canada. So thank you for listening to another Co-Management Commons podcast, and please reach out to me and let me know your thoughts on this book if you end up reading it. I'd be very curious to hear others' feedback and perspectives on this very important contribution to the study of co-management. And I'll really treasure that interaction between us. So take care and happy reading this critical new book. Hi, I'm Dr. Jamie Snook, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. Honoring the spirit and intent of agreements with Indigenous peoples is an important form of reconciliation and social justice, and educating ourselves about opportunities with co-management is time well spent. This conversation continues, so please like, share, subscribe, and visit www.comanagement.ca. Join me again next time for another interesting discussion about the co-management of fish and wildlife in Canada and around the world.